what we're going to be talking about today is whether or not the United States actually has the capacity or the capability to lead in the 21st century. And the reason why this is such an important question is because, as Christian and I have discussed multiple times, along with Tina and Hamilton, the United States is not in the best shape. And there's a lot of people that feel very, very pessimistic about the direction of the country, and for good reason. When you look at inflation, when you look at housing, when you look at the stuff that's showing up in our school system, when you look at the cultural issues that we're facing, there are a lot of reasons to be frustrated about the current state of the United States. And there is no shortage of geopolitical experts that will tell you that not only is the United States in decline, but that we deserve to be. We deserve to be horrible patriarchal exploiters that we are. And so they have predicted for a while now that going into the 21st century that this would not be another American century, that we would basically losing our place as the economic, military, and global hegemon, and we would be replaced either by China or maybe the EU or maybe by the BRICS system. And so today we're going to analyze whether or not that's true. We're going to look at some numbers that should indicate to us on whether or not the United States is still in a position to lead in the 21st century, provided that we can get our crap together. All right, so we're going to be discussing all of that and more on this episode of Making the Argument, powered by Good Ranchers.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't already, go down to the link in the description and join our community chat. We would love to get to know you there. We have some great conversations about a lot of different things, and we have folks like you help us drive the direction of the show, and we love taking your episode ideas and turning them into full episodes, and we look forward to seeing you there.
All right, as always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, a reasonably good person. Not with us today is my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees. She left me. I think she'll be back on Tuesday, but yeah, she's not here today. And I'm looking for people to blame, so we'll see what goes on. It could be the topic. Maybe it's the topic.
Yeah.
Christian picked this in a very unique.
It's my fault she's not here.
Not doomer. Christian Hines, our resident historian and political prognosticator, decided, you know what, Nick, I'm going to be optimistic, and we were all for it. We were pretty happy with it.
It's I remember when I posted the topic idea in our community chat. One of our members, Remy, was like, I can't believe it's a great idea, but I can't believe that Christian's the one recommending it. And I originally titled it "Why America Will Win the Second Cold War," because part of me was thinking that so many people think that for like the last 10 to 15 years, so many people think that China's going to be overtaking the United States. Mm-hmm. And I kind of wanted to push back on that, actually, in part because we've written a lot of why minutes challenging the notion that China's going to keep rising in the world stage. But then after I started building the outline with you for this episode, I realized that it's not just China that has problems. It's actually the rest of the entire world that has some really huge issues.
Whoa. I'm going to stop you right there. You were giving away too much, and I'm still doing introductions.
Yeah, I haven't been introduced
We haven't even
yet.
introduced Hamilton yet.
You know what?
My gosh, this is probably why Tina left.
I think that's why Tina left.
And then, of course, we have our producer of producers, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking, and apparently audio either.
Yeah.
We always got Hamilton is the only one here that actually knows how to run any of this tech, and so when anything with the tech doesn't go wrong, we all sit in there and look at him like what are you doing? As if we could do it.
This is true.
Oh gosh. All right. So let's go ahead and jump into this. The first thing that we're going to do very briefly is, obviously, I don't think we need to belabor the point about what's going on in the United States right now and the frustrating part, but we do want to at least point out, we got a really interesting poll here, political polls. This is on X, and it kind of shows.
I can't believe you just called it X.
I'm calling it X. Elon says it's his company. He wants to be X. It's X. So we've got it up here, and we're actually looking on the Economist YouGov poll, August 26th to 29th, 2023, 1,500 U.S. adult citizens. And one of the things that's interesting here, it says, do you feel that things in this country these days are under control or out of control? The number of people that thought it was under control, 15%. 71%. 71%, 1,500 adults think the country's just out of control. And again, it's not hard to see why. We are dealing with significant structural issues within the United States, especially at the federal level. And really at the cultural level as well. We've discussed this a lot, where when you have two major groups within the United States with diametrically opposed views, not just of our present, but of our past and what our future should look like, that there's problems there that have to be worked through. And So it is perfectly appropriate for Americans. If we're being patriotic, then we need to be introspective about the problems that we're facing. The real question that we have to ask, though, whenever we're talking about America's position on the world stage, and again, I'm not suggesting that we're supposed to lead in the form that we have to fight everybody else's wars and we have to be the world's police force. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about our own internal numbers when it comes to our development, when it comes to our economic progress, when it comes to crime, when it comes to social cohesion, health, right? We want to be leading in all of these areas. Right. And a lot of people feel like we're just not anymore. And because in some areas we're not. We're nowhere near the level of economic freedom that we've experienced in the past. And that has led to people assuming that countries like China or perhaps confederations like the EU could very well overtake the United States. And let's face it, some of the people, I would argue that a lot of these geopolitical analysts, especially on the left, almost kind of say this with a certain degree of glee. It's like reading, economist Paul Samuelson in the late 80s talking about how the Soviet Union was still going to overtake the United States. It's almost like they're willing it to happen because they're looking at all of our competitors in the world, and what they typically see are countries that are far more left-wing. And that doesn't mean that, everybody on the left of the United States admires everything that those countries or those areas do. But there seems to be this idea that, if only we had this sort of central planning that China does, maybe our economy would be doing better. If only we had this sort of, massive social safety net that the EU does, we would be doing better. And the real question is, okay, are they doing better? Are they in a better position, not just today, but are they in a position where they have set themselves up economically, socially, and culturally to be able to lead in the future? So the number one country that we're going to start with is the obvious one, China. China with a G. All right. So let's go ahead and go to our first one here. And we've talked about this a lot. Elon Musk has talked about this. But one of the things that you do have to consider when you're looking at the present state of your country, but also its future ambitions and its future capabilities, population matters. And China is probably currently experiencing the single largest challenge with respect to population decline, which I think most people just sounds absurd.
China, you think that sounds absurd? Get this. China is on track right now, by the end of this century, to lose 700 million people.
That's just nuts.
Their current population is about 1.3 and some change billion people. By 2100, China's population is going to fall below 800 million if their current trend continues, which it is. It's actually, China's population's already peaked. It's falling right now.
Yeah.
As we speak. It's lower today than it was, last month. And these are like Japan numbers. I mean, Japan is going through a population collapse as well. I think that one of the key takeaways that our audience will hopefully get from this when we're finished with the China portion of today's episode is that China is going through Japanification. And when I say that, I don't mean they're going to start putting out some really great anime. Yeah. I mean, their economy is stagnating and their population is literally collapsing before our eyes.
Well, we have, I think there's this Malthusian wing of the left, and a lot of it is tied in with the environmental side of the left, where it's like, well, this is actually a good thing. Wasn't China overpopulated? And when you look at what's going on, and I'm going to read off some of this from these statistics. So the National Bureau of Statistics, the UN demographic modeling reveals that China's population may drop to 1.313 billion by 2050 and fall below 800 million by 2100. The demographic shift is caused by the decreasing birth rate coupled with a rapidly aging population. Here's what needs to be understood. It's not as if people are just disappearing, right? It's not as if just Thanos snapped his fingers. You have an aging population, which is going to need to be supported by people that can actually produce the products and services, especially in a centrally planned economy like China's, where they need to be able to actually produce things to take care of people in their older age. And when you have a population that is that much older, that means you've got a lot of people that you need to take care of, but you don't have a lot of people actually producing economic value. And that sort of imbalance is devastating for an economy. I think the other thing, and I'll slow down on this, let's go to the next article real quick. So yeah, demographics may decide the U.S.-China rivalry. Scroll down a little bit on this one. Okay, so yeah, scroll down a little bit more, and you kind of see them talking about China's working age population has been shrinking since 2014 and will lose at least 100 million people by 2040. When you are taking 100 million people out of the labor market, that is going to have devastating effects on your overall GDP. All right. At the same time, the elderly population is exploding in size. By 2050, more than a third of the population, 487 million people, will be over 60 years old and in need of public support. This is what I'm talking about. This is that economic imbalance that can be absolutely devastating. The other reason why it's devastating is not just the economic component, but it's the political ramifications of when you have a shift like this. See, it's one thing when you have a lot more people in their 20s and 30s and 40s, their prime working ages, who are then, paying into these various benefits and programs that are taking care of people in their elderly years. But when all of a sudden you have a significantly smaller number of people that are trying to do that, people look at it as like, oh yeah, I guess the math doesn't add up. Yeah, the political math doesn't either, especially in countries where this is happening, where they are actual democracies, because what you have is a significant portion of the voting bloc that is not in an age where they can actually produce economic output, but they are dependent upon the benefits. And so all of a sudden you get 20 and 30-year-olds going, wait a second, I'm working myself to death, and most of it's going in taxes to actually subsidize, in some cases, the lifestyles of people that actually have more wealth than I do. And if you want to talk about a potential political crisis, that's pretty significant. In China, the other big problem, and Xi Jinping understands this, when you have 30 million young men who cannot find a wife, no prospect of finding a wife, because there's 30 million more men than women in China, that is very problematic. A bunch of very, very frustrated men that don't see themselves as having any future are ones that tend to be very violent. If you're wondering where your pool of revolutionaries that overthrow governments come from, young, frustrated men is a pretty good recruitment pool.
And passport bros probably aren't a thing in China.
No, I don't think there's a lot of passport.
It's even worse than that. Like there's projections. Let's just talk about working age population for a second. In 2015, China had about 1 billion people in their working, in the prime of their working age.
Yeah.
By 2050, so 30-year period, the number of working age Chinese is going to fall from 1 billion in 2015 to about 800 billion. Mm-hmm. Sorry, 1,800 million.
Yeah.
My bad, I misspoke. So that's a collapse of 20% of your workforce, of your prime working age population. 200 million people being removed from the working pool.
Yeah.
And so when people bring up the fact that you said it earlier, wasn't China overpopulated to begin with? They had so many people to begin with. You have to think about it from the perspective of percentages and numbers. When you cut your population, take a look at Detroit. Yeah. And ask yourself if losing over half of your population is a great thing for your economy.
Yeah.
It isn't. It never is. There's no scenario in which losing that many people from the workforce is going to produce positive returns. China's economy is probably more similar to Turkey in the 1980s than it is Taiwan in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is look at where Turkey was in the 1980s, an emerging economy, and look at where it is today. It's a disaster today. Look at where Taiwan was in the 1980s, an emerging power, and look at where it is today, a modern, first world developed, highly technologically sophisticated. It made it.
Yeah.
And China, quite frankly, I don't think China's going to make it. I think it's going to fall into what economists call the middle income trap, where it can industrialize to an extent, but it can never fully leverage it in order to become the economic hyperpower or superpower that many people, I think, predicted that it would be.
Yeah, yeah.
Quick question from one of our live stream viewers. Has anyone looked into the possibility that China's population will fall even faster because they won't have healthcare workers in geriatric care to keep the elderly population alive?
That's a great question. I think the way to think about this is not only from the practical problems that take place as a result of not having enough people within a critical sector like healthcare, but we're talking about the same communist regime that used to tell people you're only allowed to have one child, and if you have more, we're going to abort them. Well, here's my question. You think they're going to have any problem about deliberately withholding healthcare from elderly people? Do you think, have you read Animal Farm, right? the horse that works really hard, who's the dedicated socialist, he becomes glue as soon as he's no longer beneficial for the state. And the problem that we're going to run into is just like you see in places like Canada, where it's, hey, I'm feeling depressed, and my veterans benefits aren't coming in close enough. Well, have you considered suicide? Right? Do you honestly think that the Chinese government is not going to be telling 65 plus people that are not contributing to the glory of the revolution, oh, don't worry, keep living, and we'll keep supporting you? No. I do think that they're actually going to come up with a program where they deliberately either allow people to die by withholding medical care, or they come up with some sort of assisted suicide. And what they're going to do is it's going to be like a glorious and honorable thing that you do on behalf of your family and your nation, that once you've got to the point where you can't contribute, then it's just time for you to die with dignity. And I mean, look, you hear this and you think, well, that's crazy. Like, there's other civilizations within history that have adopted similar, ideas or mindsets with respect to once you become a burden on society. And yeah, I'm worried that what's going to happen is they're not just going to have a deficit of healthcare workers to be able to manage the aging population. I think they're going to take it a step further and actively work to try to reduce that population.
Got another question here from Intensive Care Bear. Is the relatively modern idea of retirement one of the driving reasons for this economic problem? If we all work till death, this would not be as big of a problem, no?
So here's the deal. I do think retirement is kind of a strange concept. I mean, obviously you get to a point where you're kind of outside of your most productive years. Now, that's been extended quite a bit with the numbers of industries that are no longer dependent upon physical labor to do the task. If you're going back 150, 200 years and 70% of your economy is agriculture, well, then obviously you get to a point where you can't do the backbreaking work, especially before, tractors and combines and everything else. And so, but even then, when you quote retired, there was still like duties that you might have had in a generational household to either help with the kids or do other things. The modern concept of retirement, where mom and dad stop working at 65 and go on cruises and the whole deal. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with anybody that wants to do those things. I do think it's a relatively new concept that we sometimes have this idea that, well, this is just the way it's supposed to be. I mean, I can tell you right now, how many of us know people that the moment they retired from their job, they didn't go into this blissful retirement where they were happy. They were horribly depressed and sometimes deteriorated rather quickly. So I don't think someone has to grind away at the same job forever until they die. But I do think that when you get to that stage where it's like, okay, I'm outside of the productive years and now I'm going to take things a little bit easier. The people that go into maybe part-time work or volunteer work, or they substitute teach, or they work at the YMCA, or they coach, or they just help out within a generational family, those people seem to thrive a lot more because they're still contributing. We've talked about this a lot. One of the problems that I think that we have, and what you see within the welfare state, is that when you take away people's responsibility for contributing anything to their own provision, to the provision of others, it doesn't free them to their, wonderful desires and happiness. And no, it makes people feel worthless.
Yeah.
And so I do think, I know the way that Tina and I are looking at this is, obviously we don't want to be in our 70s thinking, oh my gosh, if we don't put in 70 hours a week, we're not going to be able to eat, right? Nobody wants that. But I do want to be in a situation where when I'm outside of those years, I still have things that I'm doing, contributing to. I still want to be useful.
Yeah.
And I think that's a mutually beneficial environment.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but China has a huge welfare state. Right.
Oh, well, it's interesting because it's a communist state. And so their idea of a huge welfare state is, they provide education, they provide healthcare, they provide a number of other goods and services.
It's not like Europe's, though.
The question is what sort of quality are you actually getting? This is one of the troubles when socialists talk about like, oh, well, at least under the Soviet Union or under East Germany, they had, jobs and housing and clothing and health. Yeah, they had all those things. And then people risked their lives to get to a country that didn't promise them those things. What does that tell you about the actual reality? If all you want is for the government to promise you something, well, then the government gets to define that which they're promising you. You get healthcare. What's healthcare? Well, you get to go to a doctor once every 8 months, maybe. And by the way, we really don't have any of the advanced medicine or care or services that are going to help you. But we've defined what healthcare is, and we've made sure you're guaranteed some of it. So mission accomplished, right? Like, no. That's not what we mean when we say we want these things. And the question that we should be asking is, what are the best systems to produce it? And really, when we talk about, and again, I want to go back to this whole idea of, engaging in something where you're both a customer and a producer, right? That there's value in that transaction going in between two entities. That is really important for a number of reasons. And an excellent example of this is Good Ranchers, because you knew it was coming. You knew what this was.
It took me a minute.
You knew what this was.
A minute.
Because again, if you are looking for a good, strong American company, like I don't think I don't think the good people at Good Ranchers, do you know farmers? Farmers don't just sit there and retire and do nothing, man. Farmers are working that land. They're working the livestock because they love what they do and it's a part of who they are. And those are exactly the sort of ranchers, the sort of people that Good Ranchers has teamed with in order to make sure that you have quality beef, pork, poultry, seafood, all of it, right? Quality delivered to your door. And I will tell you right now, all of us has tried Good Ranchers extensively. It's becoming a regular part of all of our menu. And the reason why is because we know we're getting a quality product delivered to us. And it just, again, I mean, endless amount of opportunities with respect to recipes and things that you can try with the best meat that you can get. And right now, if you order and you use promo code Nick, you're going to get $25 off. You're going to get free shipping. And if you sign up for one of the subscriptions, so now you can you can sign up for the subscription. You don't got to wonder when it's coming. You got a package that's coming every month. You can plan your meals around it, and they're going to throw in an extra 2 pounds of ground beef to go with that, because I know I'm a burger guy. I like burgers, right? So if you want to support a great company that is doing a lot to, not only help and support this show, but providing you a quality product so you can have a meaningful transaction with a wonderful company, Good Ranchers, promo code Nick, $25 off, free shipping, 2 pounds of quality ground beef if you sign up for one of the subscriptions. I mean,
Nick, I was talking to the Good Ranchers team yesterday. They actually told me that if you subscribe, that you can pause your subscription for 3 months and still get the ground beef on your next order. So if you're worried about subscribing and having to commit to every month, you can pause, and they leave you a lot of flexibility.
They do. They're a great company to work with. Why? Because they treat you like a valued customer, unlike government agencies.
And they don't ship from China.
Yeah.
In part because I think that Xi Jinping has just outlawed the free market at this point over in that country. That's actually the I don't have any links for this. The other links that I sent you and Hamilton for this episode are kind of reiterating some of the demographic problems that China has. I think that we've talked about that enough, though, that like they're looking at a demographic catastrophe right now. But it's not just their shrinking populations that they have a problem. I mean, think about how in the 1990s, China opened up to the rest of the world, right? They actually adopted many free market reforms. But what you've seen since Xi Jinping has come onto the scene in the mid 2010s is kind of a reversion back to Marxism. And the result of that has been just utterly disastrous. Look at all the companies that have started to pull out of China. Mm-hmm. We did a Y Minute on this at the end of last year. All the companies that are pulling out of China and they're going to places like India. Yeah. And the list it just keeps going. I mean, everybody from Apple to semiconductor makers are pulling out of China and they're going to other countries. These are jobs that are leaving at the same time that the population is shrinking. The Chinese economy, in terms of the total amount of the world's number of exports, it peaked at, I think, about 16% in 2015, and it's been on a downward incline ever since. And so, I mean, basically, what I'm trying to get across to the audience here, and I want your take on this, is China's rise to power and the whole narrative that you saw in the early 2010s of them overtaking the United States and just conquering the world, I think that's been massively overstated. And we're just now starting to realize that, they have problems too. We have problems at home, and we talk about them all the time, especially on this show, but they've got problems too. And their problems are actually bigger than ours.
Why would I'm going to go back to the Soviet Union example here, because this is not the first time we've seen this, right? Paul Samuelson, who was one of the most influential economists in the United States, he's used in textbooks all over the place, was kind of a disciple of Keynes. And again, he was predicting in the late 80s, the late 80s, people, he was predicting the Soviet Union had proven that a strong, centrally command and control economy can thrive, and that it would probably overtake the United States at some point, right before it collapsed. And he was looking at the numbers that the Russian government, a communist government, was giving us and said, well, these must be true, right? Like this must be accurate numbers. And it became very, very obvious in the early 90s that was all garbage, that the Soviet Union couldn't possibly keep up, that things were going horribly internally within the country economically, that a lot of the numbers that they actually put out there were lies. And the same thing, to some degree, I think is going on with China right now. So why do you have this desperate move by many on the left to say that, oh, no, see, they've proven that this can work. And the proof for China for so long was, well, they're a communist country, right? And they're socialist, and look at their GDP numbers and look at their year-over-year growth. The problem is that, okay, well, that depends on where you start the story. Because when Mao was in charge, that was the guy that was trying to run the country like a dedicated Marxist. That was the guy that was trying to run the country completely in line with socialist principles. He collectivized farming. He decided to do mass industrialization. And how did he do it all? Well, he did it all by the government directing where people would go and what they would do and what they could own and what they couldn't own. What happened? 40 million people died, right? 40 million people died in a combination of political purges and mass famine and starvation as a result of poor policy. Was China an economic powerhouse when Mao was leading the glorious revolution? No. So what changed? Well, what changed was they massively liberalized their economy, going into the 80s. And then all of a sudden you had an influx of a country with cheap labor that could produce manufactured goods, especially like kind of low-skilled manufactured goods. And they become more of an economic powerhouse, not because they were governing like socialists, but because they kept the veneer of a socialist state but massively liberalized their economy. And by liberalized, I don't mean leftist. I mean they injected more freedom into their economic process. And so many people on the left that were pointing to a country like China going, oh, see, this is an indication that it can actually work. It's like, no, you have to look at why did all of a sudden they experience this economic growth? And the problem that we're seeing right now is Xi Jinping is, I think, realizing that a combination of, the problems with central planning, the problems with running essentially a socialist and in many cases a heavily authoritarian state, is that over time, the problems that arise are going to require you to once again crack down in order to maintain control. And so they're not going to continue to liberalize their economy. They're going to do just the opposite. And like you said, what this means now is this opens up huge opportunities for other countries, especially other countries in Asia and Southeast Asia, to be able to come more of the heavy-duty manufacturing that China has been doing for the last 20 years. And it's not as if China has developed this really good homegrown entrepreneurial network within China with the money and the time that they've had. No, they've spent it all making mega cities that nobody lives in. They have wasted so much of their money and their resources creating government boondoggles, which are causing massive housing crises within China, which is another thing that's adversely affecting their economy. So I just think overall, China is just not in a good spot right now. And I think it's going to become evident over the next really 5 to 10 years as China tries to deal with this. And I think they're going to become more aggressive. The problem that they're going to run into, I think the other problem that we're going to discover is much like with the Russian military, I think we're going to discover that the Chinese military is nowhere near as formidable as people actually think. And what's going to be interesting to see is I think China even understands that they can saber rattle all they want with Taiwan. They do not possess the military capability to launch a successful invasion of Taiwan, especially with even if the United States just provided naval and air support, no ground troops whatsoever. I think that completely erodes any possibility of China being able to successfully put the 300,000 to 400,000 troops that would be necessary to move across 100 miles of open ocean in order to successfully invade a country which has 2.1 million reserves. So when I look at all of this, I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't see it.
Got a question here from Wilhelm. Question: Why the narrative of China is why is the narrative of China winning so popular when it's not actually true?
Because people like dooming, and not only that, let's be honest, China for a long time, before Xi Jinping destroyed the country, I think China, in many respects, represented a lot of what certain people on the left actually wanted. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that the average American leftist wanted to, create concentration camps for Uyghurs, right? What I mean by that is the idea that you could have some more centralized control that dictates certain elements of the economy and then pushes goals like China's Belt and Road Initiative, or the construction of all of these apartments that are now standing empty in China. That was cheered by so many people on the left over a decade ago. People kind of forget that, in part because a lot of these policies have failed miserably and they've backfired. But I'm old enough to remember, and it wasn't that long ago, when people on the left were saying, China is providing a roadmap for how we can solve X.
Yeah.
And they're not really doing that anymore. And I think part of the reason they're not doing that anymore is because it's becoming patently obvious now that China is running into some massive, massive roadblocks that are standing in the way of it actually achieving this dominance on the global stage that I think a lot of people were originally predicting a decade ago. But in terms of popularity, I mean, people always love to, predict the demise of the United States. I mean, especially if you're on the left and you think the United States is some evil, hegemonic, superpower, super villain that, has created oppressive, hierarchies and structures that have only benefited cisgender, heterosexual white males. China in some ways represented in the past, tearing down those things. But now I think it's becoming obvious that China... I do not think that China is going to end up overtaking the United States and supplanting the U.S. as the world's preeminent power. And when I say that, that doesn't mean that I'm endorsing a neoconservative worldview where it's like the United States needs to go around and be the policeman of the world.
That's not what we're talking
what
about.
I mean by that is I do not think the United States is going to overtake the United States in terms of the leading economic force in this world. I think that the central planning model that Xi Jinping has really doubled down on is starting to backfire. And if you need proof of it, they have a debt crisis. Remember the Evergrande thing that popped up? One of the largest property developers, teetering on the verge of bankruptcy because they have something like $80 billion in debt. Actually, I think it's more than that. But also think about the protests that you might have seen on the internet last year of people protesting in front of the banks and refusing to pay their mortgages because they were paying mortgages for homes that hadn't even been built yet.
Yeah.
That's how bad their housing market has gotten. We think that we have a housing bubble in the U.S. We complain, rightfully so, that the average home in the U.S. is now, there was actually a report that came out the other day that showed that home affordability is at its lowest level in 40 years in the United States, since 1983. But consider how expensive it is to afford a house in China. You need almost a lifetime's worth of savings and income in order to afford an apartment in China.
Well, and what's interesting, the reason why so many young men are desperately trying to actually be able to afford it is because when you have 30 million more men than you do women within a country, the women get to be incredibly picky. And it is one of those things where you can't even hope to potentially get married unless you can actually provide a home. And so, this idea that you're going to go into massive amounts of debt at a really young age, just for the hopes that it'll put you in a better position to find, a wife is, that's a real issue over there. We also have this other article, China's local government debt should be the real worry. Again, this is one of those issues where it's not just what's going on at the national level in China. This is systemic throughout their entire economy. Let's go ahead and hit the next article, because I want to move on. China's economy might be nearly a seventh smaller than reported. Again, this goes in. It goes, for a country that is regularly accused of manipulating statistics, China is remarkably diligent about collecting them. The government has dispatched 2 million boffins to visit company stores and even street stalls in the first few months of this year as part of a new national economic census. Ads plastered on billboards implore people to cooperate. In a flashy promotional video on its website, the National Statistics Bureau warns that any fabrication of data is against the law. But again, I want you to imagine that the economy is 1/7 smaller than what you're actually being told. That's massive. When you're talking about I think China's a $14 trillion economy, something like that.
We don't actually know the numbers.
We don't actually know, but that's a massive shift in what the actual economic output. And like we said before, when your economy was largely based on manipulating your currency, on cheap manufacturing, and now all of a sudden you're at a point where you can't afford to continue to manipulate your currency, plus you're not necessarily leading the charge anymore on manufacturing, especially of the goods that you've kind of dominated in, you're in a real problem. The other thing that China has done, which has been kind of a strategic vision and goes with this whole idea of what I think the left kind of wanted from the United States, was they've invested a lot in other countries which possess certain strategic resources. So, for instance, you look at places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? DRC is sitting on something like $24 trillion worth of estimated mineral deposits, along with other natural resources. And China controls a lot of the mining interest over there right now. China refines 60% of the world's cobalt. And cobalt is desperately needed. Like the green energy market is highly dependent upon cobalt. Your phones are dependent on cobalt. Your electric cars are dependent on cobalt. And China has tried to position themselves strategically with everything like building ports in Sri Lanka to mining interests to things like that, to where they can dominate some of these markets. And I think it's because they've even recognized that once this gets to a certain point, they're going to have to control certain strategic resources and be one of the only people that you can get them from, because that will allow them to have greater control over what the price is within the market. But the problem they're running into is that they're still dependent upon the raw materials from other places, which means this is a wonderful time for countries like the United States to be more strategically engaged in fostering better trade relations with these countries, which China is now depend on and can hold a stranglehold on some of the future tech that's coming out. Let me see. What more do we got here? Beijing is running out of time to remake the world. This was actually back in 2021.
I intentionally pulled up some older links because I wanted to show people that this has been a problem that didn't just show up last Tuesday.
Yeah.
This has actually been, I would argue that China peaked in terms of its power and prominence in the 2015 to 2016 range. And you see that again in terms of their total number of exports versus the rest of the world. That also peaked in 2015, and it's been downward ever since. That has been a huge portion of the Chinese economy. I think that we're going to get to a point in the next 20, 30 years where people are going to be making jokes about made in India or made in Vietnam or made in Indonesia far more than made in China.
Oh, it is fascinating to me that the United States actually has a better relationship with Vietnam than China does, because you would think, okay, they're both, I mean, they're right there in the same part of the world. They're both communist countries. Obviously, we fought a very, very long, bloody, and controversial war in Vietnam. Why do we have better relationships with Vietnam? Well, again, if you look at the longer history, China's invaded Vietnam a lot too, so there's animosity there.
Vietnam is terrified of China.
They really. I think you're going to find there's really this really interesting shift in alliances where, and this is one of the reasons why it is, I believe, important for the United States to still be dominant on the world stage. And not, again, I'm not an interventionist, but I'm not an isolationist either. I want closer trade ties, and I do think that there's some value to the United States maintaining such a heavy degree of military dominance that everybody is a little bit careful about just randomly invading other countries. And I think we're going to have an opportunity to build closer relationships with India, which is something that we've wanted for a long time and haven't had, because India was traditionally far closer to the Soviet Union. That's why the United States fostered such a close relationship with Pakistan. But I think that's certainly shifted over time. Vietnam is going to be another country that I think there's huge trade opportunities with. I think it's going to be interesting to see other countries in that area, Cambodia, Thailand. Taiwan is obviously, very much within the U.S.
Thailand's a U.S. ally as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then South Korea. I mean, we talk about this before, and there's some numbers on the South Korean economy which are absolutely fascinating compared to some of the other countries that we're going to talk about here. But Japan as well. Japan's also in a lot of trouble, but have been a very, very dependable, American ally and trade partner ever since World War II. So I think, or after World War II, I should say. But so here's what I'm going to say. I think, well, let me do this first. Let's go to Professor Keene. Thank you very much for the super chat. Professor Keene asks, China has for the longest time claimed it was stockpiling gold. I am of the mind that may not be true now. They may not have anything to back their money. Well, they're definitely utilizing fiat currency, but I would say the most interesting thing with that, and we'll move on to another nation here in just a second, is the concept. Well, I don't know. Do we want to go into BRICS now, or would we rather?
Well, speaking of BRICS, Russia is part of BRICS.
Yeah.
And they're, in today's episode, I didn't want, and you know this, right?
Yeah.
We did not want to just talk about China. China is a huge threat, but the thing is that it's not just China on the world stage that has, challenged or rivaled the United States, and that people have brought up as, we're in danger of being overtaken by them. People have said the same thing about other enemies of the United States, like Russia. They've also said other things about things about more friendly organizations like the European Union as a whole. And so in today's episode, we kind of wanted to not just talk about China or the United States, but really talk about some of the other major powers around the world, and why the problems that they're facing are actually in many respects much larger than the problems that we're facing.
And that's probably a perfect thing to get into. Let's talk a little bit about BRICS, because that rolls us into Russia as well, because I don't think anybody believes that Russia in and of itself is going to surpass the United States. I don't think anybody's worried about Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. But obviously there's still concerns about the regional power that they are. So we actually did a Y-minute on the BRICS system. So I think we're going to play that to provide kind of like just some kind of like some oversight on what BRICS is, and why we don't think it has the juice basically to supplant the United States. But I will say this. The most interesting, and this gets back to Professor Keen's question, the most interesting thing I have heard come out of BRICS is the idea of a gold-based currency. Because that's, out of everything, when I look at these countries, I don't see a bunch of countries that absolutely love free markets for the most part. But whenever someone, that demonstrates an understanding that a stable currency is something that a lot of countries are looking for right now. And those countries which may have, we'll say, more of an animosity toward the United States or maybe the West in general, could see this as a potential reason to increase, we'll just say their economic ties to the BRICS system. But let's go ahead and play this video real quick. This will give you kind of like this is like a 3-minute video, give you a quick overview of the BRICS system. So let's go ahead and play that.
Sorry, guys. Got an audio problem. I'm so sorry. No,
right.
Let me work on this.
All right, we're gonna go. Actually.
Anyway, take a look at it. Y-minutes.
Can they hear us or?
They can hear us.
Okay,
Awesome.
All right, good. So here's what we're gonna do. Let's go through kind of like we did on the Y-minutes. So the big problem with Brazil was that, one, they've had, if you actually look at it, their economy hasn't caught up to where it was, I think, back in 2014.
They had a huge economic depression that hit the country in 2014 that actually led to the ousting of Dilma Rousseff, who was their socialist president, because it's a South American country. What do you expect? And but the thing is that they've never recovered. So a decade later, the Brazilian economy is still in shambles compared to where it was in 2014.
It's supposed to just now be like, I want to say like the numbers for 2023 have them projected to go a little bit higher. The thing that I'm worried about with Brazil, though, is that they've got Lula Silva back in there, and that guy is a dedicated socialist. And he's already been president once. He was actually ousted for corruption charges, and I think there was some sort of
he was originally barred from running for office.
He was convicted on charges of money laundering and corruption in a controversial trial that was later nullified in April of 2021 by the Supreme Court justices due to the court lacking proper jurisdiction over the case. So it basically got thrown out on a technicality. But there's a really interesting video out of PragerU where you have someone from Brazil talking about the problems with his policies and how he managed the country. And Brazil just seems to have this love affair with going back with socialist-oriented leaders. And if you want to read something kind of interesting about how they've mismanaged aspects with the Brazilian economy, look at the whole concept of Brasilia, right? Their major city that they developed, which was going to be kind of their capital city, centrally planned. It was going to be wonderful. And then, oh yeah, guess what? It actually didn't work. It didn't work well. So that was the issue with Brazil. Are we back up and running?
Okay, I'm going to write myself up for failing again at this audio thing.
Well, I'll tell you who's not going to overtake the United States as the next superpower.
Not Hamilton.
Hamilton is not going to overtake. All right, good.
Okay.
Let's go ahead.
I believe we should be good now.
All right, well, let's skip ahead to where we were at, though. We won't make everyone.
Okay, we'll skip around to right here.
There we go. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These 5 countries have been characterized by their large populations, huge economic potential, and powerful regional influence. They've often been seen as emerging great powers in their own right. And collectively, the popular consensus has been that the BRICS are not just capable of reshaping the international order, but could even overthrow the United States as the world's sole superpower. But behind the headlines declaring that the BRICS will overtake the U.S. and destroy the dollar, there are some serious problems. Let's start with Brazil, which is often hailed as the second greatest power in the Americas behind the U.S. itself. And that sounds pretty formidable. The only problem is that the country has struggled with political instability for the better part of 20 years. Brazil's history of electing Marxist leaders to office has led to widespread political corruption and economic mismanagement, resulting in an economy that is smaller today than it was 10 years ago. Then there's Russia. More than 30 years after the Cold War, Russia is a shadow of its former self, fighting decades of economic stagnation, isolation on the world stage, and chronic government corruption. Aside from a handful of countries, Moscow has lost its influence that it used to hold in its own backyard, to the point now that Russia is locked in a bloody war in Ukraine that has exposed the weakness of both its military and economy, an economy that's even smaller than that of South Korea. But what about India? Oh, you mean the country that has gone to war with China twice, had numerous bloody border clashes, and is currently competing for regional influence? Not to mention the fact that public polling suggests that the majority of Indians see China as their country's greatest threat. Now, maybe it's just me, but I'm not sure armed conflict mixed with widespread distrust makes for the most stable of alliances. Finally, there's South Africa. And despite being one of the most powerful countries in Africa, it has problems shared by virtually every other country in the BRICS system. Extreme political corruption, a failing economy, violent crime, and sky-high unemployment. In fact, it has gotten so bad that there are growing fears that South Africa could actually end up as a failed state. So all in all, this looks pretty bad. So why does China hold out that BRICS can succeed? Well, because quite frankly, it needs it to, and it's been willing to dish out money to develop its reputation. But wishful thinking and disdain for the United States is not what strong and lasting alliances are made of. And perhaps the greatest problem China will be facing in the next 10 years is that its own economic and political troubles are about to seriously diminish its ability to throw money around. And once Chinese foreign investment dries up, so will the alliance. All right, so that kind of gives you a once over the world of the BRICS system, and again things are not getting better. In fact, there was an article that came out by Bloomberg, and it said Africa's richest city is crumbling under chaos and corruption. Johannesburg was built on gold. It's now such a mess that homeless people direct the traffic. I mean, this is why when we look at this BRICS, so we talked about China and why China can't do this on its own. Then when we talk about the alliances, and if you look at the collective GDP of these countries, you might come to the conclusion, now we're getting close to rivaling the United States. But that's not a singular GDP. This is 5 countries in like very, very different parts of the globe with very, very different regional interests, with different languages, with different cultures, with different economies. And I just don't buy that this alliance is strong enough to actively compete with the United States economically or militarily.
I don't even think that it's worth calling it an alliance anymore, because when you look at the relationship between India and China, that relationship is completely fallen apart.
Yeah.
This year, there's been border clashes going on between Indian and Chinese troops along the Himalayas, and both sides have taken casualties, actually lost service members killed.
Yeah. And
that is not, imagine the US and the Canadians shooting and killing each other.
Yeah.
In the Great Lakes region, and then us on the world stage acting like we're allies.
Yeah.
And at the same time, opinion polling showing an overwhelming majority of Canadians and Americans viewing each other as an enemy, while the governments try to pretend otherwise. There's no way that anybody can actually look at the data, look at the polling, look at the relationship that exists between these two countries and conclude that India is actually going to help China dethrone the United States. If anything, India is looking towards the United States to develop a friendship and a partnership to push back against Chinese influence, not facilitate it.
Oh, I think we did another Wyman on this, where it's like China's biggest threat right now is not the United States, it's India. Because one, they have a history of bad relations. Then you put on top of that India is about to overtake them in population. And right as China is cracking down on the very things within its economy that were actually positive developments, India is actually moving closer toward freer markets. Now, again, that doesn't mean that they're there yet, but compared to where they were when they were doing Soviet-style 5-year plans in the 60s
the licensure
and 70s,
raj.
Yeah, I mean, it was ridiculous. And now they're moving to the point where they're making it easier to start a business. They're making it easier to actually trade and engage in commerce and the economy. So with a growing population, freer markets, and it's easier to actually start a business at the same time that China is going to be losing its manufacturing prowess. I mean, if I'm India, I'm looking at China going, yeah,
you done screwed up.
Yeah. You done effed around, and you're about to done find out.
Something tells me they might not say it like that, but with the Southern Texan accent. But no, it's true. Like, I think we've covered pretty solidly about some of the challenges that China is facing socially, economically, demographically. And it's not just China. Again, Russia is going through. In fact, Hamilton, I've got another link that I wanted to show people on the current state of the Russian demographic collapse. Here's an article from Fox that we'll just read the headline really quick. Russia sees historic population drop, spurring demographic crisis amid war in Ukraine. Russia needs up to 1 million immigrants a year for 80 years to maintain their current population levels by 2100. And then there's another Wikipedia article that I encourage people to just take a look at, not because I think Wikipedia is a great source for politics, but more because the concept is something that I don't think a lot of people know about, but this is a huge problem within Russia. There's this concept called the Russian cross, otherwise known as the death cross. And what that is at the very end of the Cold War in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, the number of deaths eclipsed the number of births in Russia. And so what it created on a spreadsheet is a cross forming where the number of deaths eclipsed the number of births. And at that intersection, what that created was a circumstance in which Russia's population began to decline. Mm-hmm. And the reason that Russia's population is declining is not necessarily the same because of China's. It's not that Russians are just aging out of the workforce. They're getting older. But really, part of the problem that they have in Russia is everybody's dying but before they actually get to old age, like alcoholism. Yeah. To give you an idea of how bad it is in Russia, I think it's something like a majority of 16-year-olds would be classified as alcoholics if they lived in the United States. That's 16-year-olds.
Nuts.
And so what Russia has right now is basically a country that it truly is, like we said in the video, it's a shadow of its former self. Think about the fact that Russia is fighting a land war, locked-in land war with trench warfare in a country that was part of Russia for something like 400 years.
Yeah. Well, and that was another thing when you look at the Ukraine war. Somebody got really mad at me on Twitter because someone was asking, how do we think the Ukraine war is going to end? And I said, well, I think it's going to end with the Russians keeping Crimea, some sort of settlement on the Donbass. They're going to give Zelensky a massive aid package and the Nobel Prize, and that's how it's going to end. And the number of people that came after me as either being pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian propaganda, I was like, I'm not using any of their propaganda. I'm just using what I know about modern conflict. And the big thing with Russia, and we kind of said this early on in that war, is that they certainly had you would have thought, if you were just looking at two Excel spreadsheets between Ukraine and Russia, you would have thought Russia's going to wipe the floor with them in a couple of months. Now, we all knew that there was probably a high degree of probability that the West would throw in a bunch of equipment in Ukraine in order to kind of stem the tide. That's exactly what happened. Essentially, Russia could not close the deal quick enough and then had to retrench because it had way outrun its supply lines. But one of the things that I remember saying, I was like, look, the Russian economy is not built to be able to sustain this indefinitely. Without achieving air superiority, which they haven't been able to do at this point, it doesn't look like they're going to be able to do, they're going to get dragged down and they're going to get bogged down in a war that at some point is going to lead to unrest in their own country. And I said this before Wagner Group decided to, point their tanks north and start driving toward Moscow, right? And again, people are getting mad at me as if I was trying to take a side in a political dispute. I'm like, no, this is just analysis. People have this image, people my age and older have this image of Russia like the Soviet Union, where they were the competing global hegemon. And I don't think they understand that Russia has a smaller economy than South Korea, right? Think about that for a second. It may be the largest country in the world. I think they have like half the population of the United States. Like a lot of their military equipment is old and aging.
A lot of it's Soviet era equipment.
And again, when you have population factors like this, when you have a serious alcoholism problem in your country, when you have a serious problem with respect to just being able to maintain birth rates, right? You probably don't have a huge portion of your population that is just raring to go to fight for the motherland in Ukraine, which is one of the reasons why it was fascinating that the Wagner Group was one of their most successful military elements. And it was a private military company comprised largely of people that have been pulled out of the Russian prison system. I mean, look, this is not me, buying into anybody's propaganda. That's just a fact. Russia is not the country it was 30 years ago.
It's not even the country it was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
In 2013, the Russian economy had a total GDP of almost $2.3 trillion. Today, it has a GDP of $1.7 trillion.
Yeah.
So that in 10 years, the Russian GDP has collapsed by over 20%. Their economy has shrunk by 20% in 10 years. I mean, to give you an idea of the weakness of the Russian economy versus the amount of power that they try to project around the world, Texas has a larger economy than Russia.
Yeah. Russia's biggest claim to fame, and this was something too that, and this will kind of help us transition to, I think, into the EU component, because that's the other big one we want to talk about. Russia's biggest claim to fame, the stranglehold it still kind of held over kind of the European economy, was its oil, natural gas. It was things of that. There's still massive amounts of resources within Russia, but they haven't all been effectively tapped. But this was actually something that Trump brought up, and it was funny because they went back later after all the gas prices and energy prices in the EU started like just going up exponentially. And Trump had said earlier on, like, you're way too dependent on Russia for your energy, and you're basically listening to a 16-year-old Swedish girl in order to develop your energy policy, and this isn't going to work out well for you. He also pointed out where it's like you have these massive welfare states in part because you don't contribute your fair share to NATO. You've allowed your militaries to kind of rot. And now all of a sudden we found ourselves in a situation in Ukraine. And who are the Ukrainians most dependent upon to support their ability to defend their country? Was it all of their neighbors that were the people that wanted to be their supposed allies and trading partners? No, it was the United States, right? We were the one, like, we don't need Ukraine economically. We don't need them strategically. You could argue that Europe has more of an interest in Ukraine since Ukraine is, in Europe. And then I'm looking around at economies like Germany, which is the third largest economy in the world, fourth largest economy in the world. I think it goes US, China, Japan, Germany. And then the UK, France, they're all in like the top 12.
India actually is. This is something that we're going to get to when we get to the decline of the EU, because here's the thing. I've got some great news for the tankies. We're not just criticizing China and Russia. There's actually some major systemic problems facing the European Union. Yeah. And not just the European Union, also the UK. I say the UK because they left the European Union, so they don't fall into that anymore. But I think that everybody kind of knows the problem that Russia has. I mean, Ukraine is a prominent example of it, but it's not just Ukraine. They also have some demographic problems. They certainly have some economic problems. Again, it's a fact that Russia's economy has shrunk. Yeah. Their GDP has shrunk by almost 20% since 2013. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah.
But when you go further west in Europe, it's not like Russia is some crumbling empire and the rest of Europe is a bastion of economic growth and prosperity.
Yeah.
In fact, in many ways, I would actually argue in many ways, Europe actually has some problems that Russia doesn't have. So, for example, Russia does not have any sort of problem when it comes to energy insecurity, like at all. Mm-hmm. You go to Russia. In fact, so this is something that Russians do that I think is actually quite funny. When they try to troll people in Western Europe, they will do live streams on places like Twitch and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And you know what they do?
No.
They walk into their kitchen and they turn their stove on and they leave it there and they let it run for an hour on a live stream.
Oh my gosh. Just as a flex.
To just flex against the Western Europeans that go cold every single winter because, Western European countries decided that they wanted to prioritize green energy over, actually heating their homes. This is what happens when you take economic and energy policy from a Swedish high schooler.
Yeah.
And Russia did not take economic and energy policy.
To some degree, now they did France. Like France went all in on nuclear energy. I want to say it's something like 70% of their energy consumption is nuclear, and so they're actually in much better shape in some respects. But again, nuclear energy is good for some things. It doesn't actually help fuel your cars.
And France has other problems, like a massive socialist welfare state that's destroying their country, systemic, huge internal divisions when it comes to issues like immigration and stuff like that. And
let's do an over. Let's click on the next one real quick here. Let's look at the EU, because the reason we wanted to bring up the EU is again we go into this idea of there seems to be this obsession with who's going to overtake the United States. And again, kind of almost a gleeful obsession from some people on the left that see these other countries and see, with the exception of Russia, right? They see these other countries and they hold them up as what the United States should be more like. Why aren't we more like the EU? Why aren't we more like, China in certain areas, not in other areas? But it's this desire to prove that that either socialist economies work, and that you saw the love affair with Venezuela too when Hugo Chavez, before it all collapsed, and then everyone forgot about Venezuela. And you see this regularly, right? It's the love affair with Castro and Cuba, and then it's the love affair with Chavez and Venezuela, and then when it doesn't work, they all forget that that wasn't real socialism. But then they point to countries like China, and it's like, oh, see, the centralized planning can actually work. And they'll always do the obligatory, like, well, we don't like some of the human rights violations, but at least they're providing better healthcare than we are over. And then it never ends up being true. But with the EU, it's kind of a different argument. Now, they will oftentimes try to say, well, I just want a socialist economy like Belgium, or I just want a socialist economy like Denmark. I'm like, well, I've got bad news for you. They don't have socialist economies. Now, what they do have is economies which are far more regulated, far more heavily taxed, with a much more expansive welfare state. That's what they have. They still have capitalist economies. But this kind of begs the question, like, okay, if you think that the EU is the model that we should have been following for economic development, allow me to point to this chart here, because what you're going to find is that economic development in the EU for over a decade has essentially been flat. Like non-existent growth. That's incredible.
For our audio listeners, we'll probably read through some of these things. The size of the European Union's economy in 2008, so what, like around almost 15 years ago?
Yeah.
Was $16.2 trillion with a GDP per capita of $37,000. Look at it today. $16.6 trillion.
Yeah.
Almost, in 15 years, it's gone almost nowhere.
Yeah.
GDP per capita, $37,000. That is almost zero. Almost zero economic growth in 15 years. Well, and if you want an idea of just how bad it is, Hamilton, pull up the image that's your second to last link that you've got here. This is a comparison chart between the size of the European Union's economy and the United States' economy from 2008 to 2013. Yeah. In 2008, the United States had a total GDP of just a tinge under. Basically, it was tied. It was around $15 trillion for both of them, according to this chart. And By the way, I'm pretty sure that this figure actually cuts out the UK from both figures because the UK is left. Yeah. And so the reason that these numbers are a little bit lower for the EU versus the previous chart is because they're removing the UK from it to make it a fair comparison. But the size of the Eurozone in the US was almost identical in 2008. The economy sizes were almost the same. Since 2008 until 2013, the United States has almost doubled the size of their economy, from about 15 trillion to almost 30 trillion, almost 27 trillion actually. So the US's economy has grown something like 40 to 45% in 15 years. The European Union's economy has gone nowhere in 15 years. The US now has an economy that is twice as large as the European Union's economy.
And this also goes to the idea where let's look at what does it take to actually become global hegemon, right? What does it take to replace the United States? Well, part of it is obviously your economic development. Now it's important to remember that, again, Germany, like 4th or 5th largest economy in the world. I think France and UK are both in the top 10 or 12. So there is a lot of wealth within Europe, and especially Western Europe. But it's nowhere near the United States, even when you take all of them and you put them together. And then the other problem on top of that is that this was also, I would argue that the whole issue with Ukraine, when you look at the popular response toward defending Ukraine in places like Germany, in places like France, in places like, well, pretty much all of those zones, the UK, et cetera, it was this idea that this was an existential threat, that this was a fight against total injustice, and we were going to do something about it. Now, here's a very simple question. Germany, France, the UK all have much larger economies than, I won't say much larger, they have larger economies than Russia, correct? All right. So presumably they would actually be able to maintain especially altogether, a military and the ability to provide military resources to Ukraine that should have been sufficient without the United States actually carrying the total of the work. Why couldn't they? Well, it's because many of these European nations for the longest time have decided that, you know what, we have the most powerful military in the world. Why should we develop our own? I always said, it's like, no, NATO's got an incredibly powerful military. They just base it in the United States. Right? So it was this idea that they didn't take personal responsibility for their own security because the U.S. got this. And then all of a sudden, when there was a threat, once again, it was like, ooh, America with your big, strong muscles. Can you come help us over here? Like, wait a second. You've been calling us a bunch of like jerks and hegemons and constantly interfering in world affairs. And guess what? There's times where I actually agree with that narrative about U.S. foreign policy. But I find it a little bit disingenuous that the same people that are constantly telling the U.S. to go over, sit down there in the corner because it's not your turn anymore, are completely dependent on us to come in and save a region which should be their responsibility. This should be their bread and butter. And yet they're not able to do it because, one, they don't have the economic growth to do it. Two, they have huge problems with respect to currency in the euro. Three, they haven't developed the sort of military capacity that they should have based off of their economic power. And four, they've developed a culture where, this isn't necessary. We're going to solve everything through diplomacy. Well, solving everything with diplomacy works real well until a guy like Vladimir Putin decides, yeah, I'll see your diplomacy and I'll raise you a division of T-80s. Right? So I'm looking at EU going, you guys can't lead on the world stage. You can't supplant the United States on this, not simply because you don't have the economic prowess to do it, and because you have essentially babied your entire population with this cradle-to-grave welfare state where they all think everybody should be able to get the same job and then retire at 60 and just live off of, I don't know, I guess other people working until they die at age 95. And then they don't even have the ability to protect people within their sphere of influence. And I'm looking at this like, this is a joke. This is a joke.
The EU is a complete joke. I mean, and it's falling apart. I mean, quite frankly, when I look at European governments, I see weakness.
Yeah,
is what I see.
Well, look at France right now. I mean, they had a huge influx of immigration from, country like Syria, et cetera, from North Africa. And some of that was based off, I honestly believe some of this was based off of just genuine altruism and trying to help people that were fleeing a war-torn area as refugees. I think some of it was based off of some of the guilt with respect to colonialism and things like that in Africa. And look, I'm not an anti-immigration person, but I will say this, when you have a massive influx of in some of these places, these war-torn areas that were not just refugees fleeing, a war-torn country. That's not what was going on here. And you're starting to see this issue where it's like, okay, wait a second, there is something to be said for people coming to your country that want to come into your country because they want to be a part of the country. Like, I think it's a wonderful thing when people immigrate to the United States because they really want to be Americans. They want to be a part of this American dream. And I think it's a beautiful thing when people can see something and be like, you know what, I want to be a part of that. I've once said I have far more in common with somebody with some poor kid in New Delhi that desperately wants to dream big and accomplish something with his life and feels like the United States is the place that he can do it. I have far more in common with that kid than I do with some spoiled brat born in the United States that's constantly complaining about what an oppressed class they are, when in most cases they haven't actually undergone anything resembling oppression. Right, I have far more in common with the foreigner that comes to the United States with that sort of mindset than I do the person domestically born here with this poor is me, woe is me mindset. But having said that, if a lot of people are coming into your country and they have absolutely no desire to be a part of the country, well then you're going to. It is not racist or wrong because that can be true of anybody regardless of their skin color or their background. When you have people coming into your country that have no desire to be a part of it, there's going to potentially be problems there. And that's what you're seeing in places like Paris. On top of that, the other riots that you're seeing, it's interesting because we'll sometimes point at these riots and be like, oh yeah, look what's going on in France. But then you look at what they're rioting for and it's like, we have to adjust the retirement age 2 years because it's not fiscally sustainable. And people are literally throwing bricks through windows because how dare you? This is my right. Like, did you honestly think this was going to last forever? Did you honestly think that you could maintain a declining birth rate, a declining economic development, and then still be able to retire with full benefits? Who's going to pay for it? And the answer was, we'll just increase immigration, and then that will produce it. Okay, but if you're increasing immigration for people that want to come to your country and be a part of it, that's fine. That can work really, really well. If you're increasing immigration for people that don't necessarily want to be a part of your country and think it's evil and would like to destroy it, well, that's probably going to be problematic and not actually contribute to the problems for which you increased immigration.
It's the lack of assimilation and then the cultural divides that creates is what's tearing apart some of these countries, particularly France. Remember, there were some terrible riots that happened in that country just a few months ago during the summer, in part because of this problem. And it's not just immigration that they're having to deal with. Like think about all of the populist movements that are picking up steam in Europe right now. And for good reason, because the standard of living has either gone nowhere or in many cases have actually declined over the last few years. Look at the United Kingdom, for example. I mean, the inflation crisis that we had here is actually dwarfed by the inflation crisis that they had in many of these European countries that relied on Russian energy in order to fuel themselves. That got shut off. And so prices went through the roof at the same time that they also printed trillions of euros in 2020, just like the US did. And that created generationally high inflation. The economic side of this problem is more than just their GDP hasn't grown in 15 years. That's a huge problem.
Yeah. But
it's led to a level of political division that, for example, the AfD in Germany, Alternative for Deutschland, the considered far right party, which by the way, they're actually not far right. All that they're saying is we need to secure our borders and Germany should be taking care of Germans, not being the policemen of Europe, bailing out the Greeks and stuff like that.
Yeah, when German taxpayers have to pay out the Greek economy because they've created this elaborate welfare state that again allows for early retirement that is not sustainable. It is not racist or mean for people to say, wait a second, I pay taxes for the benefit of the people within my country. And guess what? The people within my country can be all kinds of skin colors, all kinds of ethnicities. That's not the issue. But that's who my tax dollars are supposed to be helping first. And now you're telling me, no, this other country has completely botched their monetary policy, completely botched their fiscal policy, wait a second, screwed up all this stuff. And then I've got to pay to fix that first?
To give the devil his due, Greece did not botch their monetary policy.
Because of the euro.
The European Central Bank botched the monetary policy because they all have a monetary union.
Yeah, they do.
But it is true certainly that they certainly botched their fiscal policy. The point is that Look at the rise, the opinion polling. Actually, Hamilton, would it be possible for you to pull up one more link?
Sure.
Go to Wikipedia. Actually has a good archive of opinion polling for this. Go to Wikipedia and then type in, or just type in next German federal election. I want to show people the opinion polling that's going on right now and the political earthquake.
Right here?
Yes. Actually go back real quick. Click on the opinion polling for the next German federal election. I want to be able to show people the graph here. This is terrifying some of the wokeists and leftists operating in Germany right now. By the way, the CDC, the black line on this graph, let me describe it for the audio listeners. This is a
How about describe it for me? I'm looking at it. I don't understand.
So this is a graph showing opinion polling in Germany for the next federal election that'll be taking place in, I think, 2025.
Okay.
And black is the CDC, which is kind of their bland
That's
center
the
right
Christian
party.
Democrat, yeah.
They're actually very left wing by our standards, but they claim to be center right.
Yeah.
Red is the socialists.
Yeah.
Pretty self-explanatory. Green is the Greens, even further left. Yellow are the Free Democrats, which used to be the Libertarian Party, and now they're more of the Libertarian Party. They're actually terrible. They used to be pretty good, but then they made a deal with the devil and created a flashlight coalition with the Greens and socialists. And then pink are just straight up commies.
Yeah. Not even hiding it.
Blue is Alternative for Deutschland, which looked at the direction the CDC was going and looked at the direction that the Free Democrats were going and was like, you guys became a bunch of woke leftists. There is no true right-wing party or even center-right party in Germany anymore at this point. So we're gonna just build our own. And lo and behold, they're quite popular. They're actually now polling in second place. And you know what the response from the German government was? To debate banning them from participating in the next federal election because they're a threat to our democracy. Yeah, it's not, apparently it's not their democracy. It's when they say it's a threat to our democracy, what they mean is it's theirs, not yours.
Yeah, that is increasingly becoming the narrative. You see it with free speech. You see it with, again, voting. It's our democracy, not your democracy. But no, that's incredible. And again, they always come up with
Hamilton. Can you also do the same thing for the UK? Can you look up the opinion polling for the next UK election? This is going to be incredible when you see the decline and fall of the Tories. It is a disaster, and you know what? They deserve it. They deserve is somebody who firmly identifies on the right. Yep. Click on this. The Tories deserve to get absolutely blown out of the water in the next election. This chart is incredible. Remember, in 2019, the Tories won in a landslide against Jeremy Corbyn. Just demolished them.
Oh, yeah, you can see right there on the graph.
Now.
Yeah, Labour's going to crush them. And it's going to drive the UK into some really bad places.
But you know what? The Conservatives deserve it because last I checked, the Conservatives have been running this country have been running the UK since 2010. So for 14 years, they've been running the country. Guess what? It was conservative governments that decided we're going to import literally millions of people from the rest of the world, not have them assimilate to British culture. And we're also going to, you walk into London today, there's this video from this channel called Britannica. Titled, Tourism in Merry Old England. And he's going to like the heart of London and it's 0% of the population there identify as British. And at the same time that he's walking around and it's, hijabs everywhere, the government is hanging the trans pride flags from the street poles.
It's
in downtown London.
Well, and you're seeing, I'll tell you what, you're starting to see really interesting things. Like going back to the United States for a second, I want to say in Minnesota right now, it's Christian and Muslim parents that are showing up together at like school board meetings and things like that. That's what's going to be interesting about watching some of this is that, again, it always gets chalked up to, quote, racism when it's like, no, it's the question of people living in society with one another have to agree on certain precepts with respect to the way society is going to operate, the general rules. Like it was, I think it was Daniel Bell that said, culture is society's attempt to come up with a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that we face throughout our lives. And I think that's largely accurate. And so the question is not skin color. The question is not, it's not even a heritage really at the end of it. The question is do we agree on the general rules of what actually makes us a unified nation? And if the answer to that is no, well then you're going to have problems. Like it was interesting. We were watching an article the other day where they were talking about, I forget what country it was. But they were talking about that there'd been an influx of people coming into the country. There'd been all this different ethnic tension between these various ethnic groups. And the reporter actually said, this has caused a lot of political unrest and crime and internecine violence. And I said, I guess diversity is not their strength. And again, it's one of these cliches that the left has put out that, diversity is our strength. Well, it depends. If by diversity you mean we have different capabilities that we're able to use in conjunction with one another to achieve a common end state, then absolutely diversity is your strength. If it means that you have a bunch of different perspectives or ideas or concepts which are also working toward a common end state, yes, diversity is your strength. If it means you have a bunch of diametrically opposed views which are impossible to reconcile with one another, well, then diversity is probably going to be a problem for you. But I think all of us are so sick of these tropes where we just throw out a word as if it has an inherent moral meaning when it doesn't. And then the end result is well, yeah, of course this would have happened.
I love how the same people who say diversity is our strength would never say that if you tried to apply that to ideological diversity. Because remember, these are the same people who say this is a threat to more democracy. Yeah. I ask the diversity is our strength people. Oh, okay. What's the diversity of your humanities department at your local university?
Yeah.
What's the ideological diversity, ideological makeup of that? Is it homogeneous or is it ideologically diverse?
Yeah.
There's only certain types of diversity that these people care about. And for some reason, it never seems to play out when it comes to, hey, how about we have conservative voices in public? No, they're a threat to our democracy. Yeah. There's a comment from Angel D. What would it take for the EU to revert the socialist policies and reintroduce true capitalism? Seems conservatives everywhere have sold out. I'll tell you what it takes.
Thanks for the super chat.
Yes, thank you, Angel. Go ahead.
Pinochet.
No.
It would take a military dictatorship because clearly democracy has absolutely produced nothing but wokeism and woke light in Western Europe. No, okay. And in all seriousness,
do not agree.
Here's what I know that Nick wouldn't agree, but here's what it actually would take. And by the way, I don't actually think that a military, because here's the problem. You can say, oh yeah, we're going to get a military strongman in place that believes in free markets. Yeah, what happens when he's gone? Yeah. And then you get Xi Jinping that comes in next.
I got news for you. That almost never happens.
Yeah. The problem that they have is, quite frankly, we've talked about this concept, the Leviathan. They have a stronger Leviathan in the EU than even we do here. Yeah. There's no competing voices that emerge
the Conservative Party in the UK are not sitting there arguing. Like it hasn't been since Margaret Thatcher that they actually had a conservative leader in the UK that was saying, no, we need to denationalize the mining industry. We don't need more government control over industry. We need more private sector control over industry. But the problem is, to answer Angel's question, is that it really depends. I've come to the conclusion that when the government is primarily responsible through statute, which means they've actually set up laws where they're doing this, when the government becomes primarily responsible for your education and your health care, I think it's really, really hard to revert back. I think it's really, really hard to revert back. And in the United States, we've kind of resisted the idea of nationalizing healthcare, but the government is so involved in healthcare and it's caused so many problems with respect to delivery and with respect to cost that they are creating the problem so that they can then come around on the other end and offer themselves as the solution. But think about this for a second. When you see the government as essentially the only entity that you can afford to do business with, when it comes to educating your children. Well, your children are going to get an education based off of what that government wants your children to know about the world. Not to mention to know about their own government, which that should be concerning. The other side is now it's your healthcare. So now literally from cradle to grave, your dependency upon the government system and the politicians that control it is very, very significant. And then you add on top of that your licensure restrictions, your regulatory policy, your tax burden, your social welfare state. And after a while, you end up growing up in a world where this is just the way it works. I've done this example before when I talk about let's imagine, let's compare what the government did with education, and let's compare it with grocery stores. If the government opened up 10,000 government grocery stores and made you shop at one based off of your address, and when you went in to get your groceries, you didn't individually select your groceries, you were just handed a bag based off of the caloric index that the government has decided is appropriate for your family. Now, if I described all of that to you and I said, well, this is the way we're going to run grocery stores, you would be horrified, because you know that it doesn't have to be that way. And that would be far worse than what you currently have. Well, what happens when you've grown up in a country where that's all you know? Because I guarantee you, if the government actually instituted a policy where they ran grocery stores, and 60 years from now, you had 2 generations of people that don't even remember private grocery stores. The moment anyone came in and said, hey, there's a better way to do this, this is horribly inefficient and nobody likes what's going on, they would say, you don't want poor people to eat. You want people to be dependent on the risky private sector, and you want greed to determine who gets food and who does. Do you doubt me? Does anyone doubt that's exactly what they would say if the government was running that sector of the economy? Okay, well, now what do they say on education? What do they say on healthcare? You want people to die in the streets unless they can afford it. You don't want poor kids to be able to get an education. Well, none of that's true. We're just skeptical of them having this much control over things which are so pivotal and important to our lives. But once you get people convinced that this is the only way, or the most moral way, or the most beneficial way, or the most egalitarian way to do it, it becomes incredibly difficult to talk them out of it, because where are they going to learn the alternative? In the school that the government controls? I doubt it. Has that been our experience in the United States? No.
Julius asks what we mean by the Leviathan.
That's a great question.
So, you've kind of coined this term for us. So, I mean, you go ahead and explain.
So, we actually got the term from someone else, right?
Well, the term Leviathan, traces back to like Hobbes.
Okay.
But it's been used to refer to different things. This is a term that many people have come up with different things. People have called it the system, the establishment.
The Matrix.
Yeah,
the
Andrew
cathedral.
Tate calls it the Matrix. The neo-reactionary people like Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land call it the cathedral. We like to call it the Leviathan. The reason that they call it the cathedral is I think that Yarvin was trying to make the argument that it operates almost like a religion without God, unfortunately. It's almost like an atheistic religion or a materialistic religion, but it keeps many of the same components of the religious fervor that
it has the sacraments, and it has its heretics, and it has its high priests.
And so when he calls it cathedral, what he's referring to is the institution itself. And I choose the term Leviathan. I think in part because I want to signify just how dangerous it is. And what I mean by Leviathan is I'm referring to, consider this for a second, and I believe that Julius is actually in the UK, so I'm going to try to use some British examples. Have you ever considered why I'm actually taking a master's course right now with the University of Birmingham online, so I'm going to use this as an example. Have you ever considered how the faculty of the University of Birmingham, the newscasters at the BBC, and the leadership of the Tory party all seem to believe in the same thing? Oh, and also most of the corporate board of members of
the Labour Party.
Yeah, and the Labour Party, and most of the corporate board members of the FTSE 100, which is their largest stock exchange or stock market in the UK. So, Julius, I present that question to you because if you think about academia in the UK, I'm going to use a UK example since we're talking about China, Russia, and the European Union in this episode. If you think about academia in the UK, if you think about the art industry, if you think about the media, if you think about many of the corporations that operate in London, when you think about the political class and the establishment that go to all the elite schools in the UK and then go into politics, and then they become people like David Cameron or Rishi Sunak, they all seem to believe and operate in the same mindset. They all believe the same axioms. They might disagree on what the marginal top tax rate should be, but they do not disagree on some of these fundamental things about reality, the nature of government, the nature of economics. They all kind of operate on the same page there. The Leviathan or the cathedral is all of these non-government institutions that work in conjunction to push a specific narrative. And that narrative is a left-wing narrative. This is why the phrase, the Leviathan only swims to the left. I think Yarvin actually originally used the phrase that Cthulhu only swims to the left. He was referring to H.P. Lovecraft when he wrote that. But the point is that what we're referring to are the non-government institutions that operate in society that are all pushing the same message. In the US, we would point to Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the university system, all the major newspapers and TV outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC, CNN.
Just look at Fox recently.
Fox has gone woke. We think of corporate America. They've gone woke despite the fact that the right is the pro-free market force in America. Corporations are not supporting the right, they're supporting the left. And so we wonder why this is the case. And this is where the concept of the Leviathan or the cathedral comes into place. And when you understand, here's the thing, it's not a policy prescription. Understanding what the cathedral is or the Leviathan doesn't tell you what to do politically, right? It's not saying the solution is this. It's providing you a framework through which you can understand why we're living in the clown world that we now live in. And when you understand that framework, then you can come up with some solutions. So, for example, you can use this framework to conclude we need more intentional communities. The dark side is I said this earlier, half joking, or you could come to the conclusion that we need a military strongman dictatorship. But you could come to radically different conclusions. I think that we as classical conservatives would use this framework of the Leviathan or the cathedral and try to say, the solution is you can't vote your way out of this problem, and politicians aren't coming to save you. If you want to fix the problems in your country, Julius in this case is in the UK, I think that it starts with, if you're living in the UK, you need to start forming some intentional communities, because it is obvious the Tories are not going to save you. The Tories are the problem. I'll be straight up honest. The Tories are the problem. Labour is definitely not the solution. Yeah. But the Tories have created the problem right now in the UK because they've been running the show for the last 14 years. And when you live in a country where your choice is between the woke party that is pushing the stuff that's destroying your country or the avowed socialist party that will destroy your country economically, you have no political solutions at hand. You have to start operating outside of politics in order to tear down the Leviathan, create counter institutions. This is what Gramsci understood from the left. He looked at Western Europe and concluded the reason they didn't have a communist uprising and revolution is because, quite frankly, the culture in the West is not conducive to the type of culture that they had in China and Russia. And so if we're going to overthrow the capitalist system, we need to create a counterculture. We as conservatives need to do the same thing. We have to create counter institutions to challenge the cathedral or the Leviathan, make them uncool, tear them down, and then create a new culture through which we then can achieve political solutions.
Yeah, I think, when I think of the term Leviathan, I really think of the various institutions, social, economic, professional, political, that are rooted in a very, very similar leftist ideology, which actually provides them some kind of uniformity of understanding of the past, understanding of the present, and objectives for the future. And when I say left-wing ideology, that's exactly what I mean. They want greater central planning. They're very hostile toward what we would call traditional norms with respect to family, with respect to men and women. Very, very generally speaking, hostile toward traditional concepts of religion. They don't mind kind of these new woke progressive forms of religion, but they certainly don't like the traditional versions where people actually believe in like the Bible or the Talmud or whatever. And so I think that if you understand that when we say the Leviathan, we're not just talking about left-wing politicians or political parties. We're talking about all of those institutions which have essentially become kind of captured by this ideology. And then the question is dividing them out into which institutions do we still fight within. So obviously your political structure is one where you've kind of got to still fight, right? But then there's other institutions within like arts and entertainment or media or academia where you have to ask yourselves, are you really going to change the nature of Cal Berkeley at this point? Will they even allow the nature of what they're doing to be changed? Probably not. Okay, well then do you spend all of your time trying to fight to change that particular university, or do you set up a counter educational institution which actually operates in a way that we think would be more beneficial? And then we allow people to draw the appropriate contrast based off of the results. And so that's a large part of what we mean when we talk about Leviathan. Torino, thank you for the super chat. When government dependence is all you know, change and freedom is scary. That is absolutely true. And this couldn't be truer too than in the welfare system. I mean, it is literally set up in such a way to where when you start to actually benefit economically from the labor that you're doing, you almost inevitably run into this problem where if you make just a little bit more, you no longer qualify for the benefits. And so you have a perverse incentive to never get past a certain point because the jump that it takes to make it actually worthwhile doesn't exist. And you have to wonder on welfare traps like that, when they're set up and they're allowed to exist decade after decade after decade with no apparent real desire to significantly alter or shift them, you have to wonder if it's not intentional. I mean, it's fascinating that when welfare reform actually got through, and I think 94, 95, we saw, it turns out that when you actually put restrictions on welfare, it didn't make people poorer. People actually got wealthier because they actually saw a mechanism, and there was a drive to go out and to engage in productive labor. And you saw wealth go up, you saw happiness go up, you saw independence go up. And then when all of a sudden we take that back because that's mean and it's cruel and how could you treat people this way, they delve back into the welfare trap. And so, yeah, I'm with you. I think we get to the point where it becomes pretty obvious that there is a political incentive to keep people in a certain stage of perpetual poverty. And again, if you've convinced yourself that, well, it's because the whole system's arrayed against them and they can never do better anyway, then you can maybe satiate some of your own guilt as you continue to perpetuate that policy. But ultimately, I think you're still, complicit. Jacob, thank you for the super chat. Why do you think conservative politicians at large have sold out? Anytime they try to walk the policy fence, they tend to fall off the liberal side. No, let me give some insight onto this from inside the political structure. I can't tell you how many times there's been a potentially controversial issue. Well, what made the issue controversial? Well, what made the issue controversial was because we were opposing the Leviathan. It wasn't because they had more votes than we had in the legislature. It was because if we put our foot down on this particular policy, or if we advance this other policy, well, then the media and academia and Hollywood and everyone else is going to come after us and we're going to lose elections and then it's going to be even worse. So we've got to compromise on this principle in order to stay in power. And here's what almost inevitably happens. The compromise takes place and it always goes in one direction. And then you don't maintain power because you were weak and you didn't actually provide an alternative. But you can constantly justify your compromising on issues that you shouldn't compromise. I'm not saying compromise is never appropriate, but in a lot of these core fundamental issues, it is inappropriate. But they can always go back and say, well, that's just what the people wanted. I remember sitting next to somebody who I liked, was a friend, who sat there and said, well, this is just what the people want. On a bill they had voted against 4 years in a row because we had all agreed it was really, really bad policy. But then all of a sudden we lost some seats. Our majority wasn't as significant. And we better adapt to what the people want. Well, I got news for you. The people made that election choice that particular year, not because of this issue, but because of other things that were going on that were completely beyond our control. It was things going on at the federal level. But then all of a sudden there was this big, massive conservative push to, well, we better compromise on some of these issues. And then what did we do? We created massive problems for us going forward, budget-wise, healthcare-wise, et cetera. They're going to be difficult to reconcile and that we're going to be dealing with for decades now that didn't achieve the stated objectives. And that's where we're at. And they will constantly feel justified in doing it because, well, this is just where people are going. And my argument is, well, wait a second. If you think it's wrong, if you don't think it's good policy, then you stand up, you say that, you vote, and then you let the chips fall where they may. Because my job is not to be the better conductor of the train wreck. My job is to try to keep the train from going off the cliff and to change tracks into a direction that actually makes sense based off of what I believe to be true. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people within conservative politics that they believe that what representative government is them sticking their finger up to see which way the wind is blowing under any given situation and then adjusting their vote appropriately based off of CNN polls. That's not what representative government is supposed to be. Representative government is, I am honest with my constituents about what I believe, why I believe it, and what I intend to do. And then they determine on whether or not the value system that I have presented to them, the thought process that I have presented to them is representative of what they want in Richmond or Washington, D.C. That's what representative government is. It's me coming home after session and them not being confused at all about how I voted. And if they like it, they continue to reelect you. And if they don't like it, you go home. But what you're not supposed to do is fundamentally alter your core principles in order to stay elected. What are you staying elected for? If you've got to constantly alter your core principles in order to do it because you're scared about what big tech will say, or you're scared about what the media will say, or you're scared about what academia will say, I got news for you. They don't like you. And yet I will go down to Richmond year after year after year, and I will sit there and I will listen to people that not only compromise with it, but then shovel hundreds of millions of dollars in tax dollars into institutions which hate us. And we're using our constituents' tax money to do it. And I'm sitting here going, this doesn't make sense. Well, yeah, but if we do this, we're going to lose the message. And then some of those same people wonder, like, Nick, why do you spend so much time on social media? Because I never want the narrative, the message that I'm sending to my people, my constituents about what I do and why I do it. I never want it to be exclusively through the lens of the Washington Post or the Richmond Times-Dispatch or the Culpeper Star-Exponent or whatever else, because I know I'm not going to get a fair shake with most of those institutions. So I go directly to people and I make the argument for what I believe is correct. And I will let the chips fall where they may, because ultimately the worst thing anybody can do to me within politics is say, Nick, we've decided not to reelect you. Well, I guess I'll go home and spend a lot more time with my family and probably make a lot more money in the private sector, because I will tell you this, politics has not been an economically conducive thing when you're having to leave your job for 60 days at a time to go down to Richmond. But it's set up the way it's supposed to be, a citizen legislature. We're supposed to be responsive to our constituents. But my gosh, they should be able to depend on the idea that when we tell them this is what we believe, that will be reflected in the way that we vote. But there is a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear associated with politics, especially when people feel like every single major culturally shaping institution is against them. But the answer to that is not to be a coward in Richmond. The answer to that is to be bold within those institutions, or to set up counter institutions so that you can actually present an alternative to people instead of the constant drumbeat of ideological narrative that they're getting through academia, through the media, through the arts and entertainment. Part of our job is to make sure that the people that agree with us don't feel isolated. And there's no greater act of betrayal, I think, by an elected official than to say that because we're scared of the same institutions that are making our constituents feel isolated, we're going to join with the institutions. We should be standing up to them on behalf of our constituents. I get so pissed when somebody down there will say something that is just completely incendiary, because they're not just saying it toward me, they're saying it toward the people that sent me there to speak for them. And so it's about time a lot more people in elected office stand up, grab whatever you need to grab, and then actually be angry on behalf of your constituents, which are being continually insulted by people down there in positions of political power. So anyways, that's my take on it.
We have another super chat from Jim Ross. Thank you for the super chat. The U.S. can look at Canada for a government that speaks of aspirational goals. Policies are geared towards these goals that don't take reality into account. Policies fall, then authoritarian solutions are implemented.
No, Jim, that's an excellent observation. It's and this is the part where here I want to get to the wording of this question, because I think the way he worded it is very important. A government that speaks of aspirational goals and policies that are geared toward these goals, but the goals don't take into account reality. And then when they fail, their solution is not to go back and be like, you know what? We had good aspirations, but something didn't work. So maybe we should reevaluate how we're going to achieve these goals. No, that's never the case.
No, it's the people were wrong.
It's we weren't given enough money. We weren't given enough power. We weren't given enough authority. The people weren't good enough to implement our policies. And it creates a drive toward more authoritarian states, because they're so convinced that, no, this is the only solution. And if you don't actually implement that one, then something is wrong with the people, not the solution. And Peterson talks a lot about this too, because he's undergoing this now, where it's like, he goes like, wait a second, I criticized Trudeau and now my license might be taken away in Canada. That doesn't sound authoritarian to you? The same people screaming that our democracy and free speech, unless of course you say something that we don't like or criticize one of our policies, because then that must necessarily mean that you're evil. And if you're evil, then you don't deserve freedom of speech and you don't deserve your license to practice. So no, spot on, Jim. That was very good. All right, Ellen, not Sarah Lee. Do you think it's possible to reverse what Biden has done? Can a career politician do it? So I don't think the issue is so much just what Biden has done. I think is what has taken place over the last 7 decades. More than that, it's over 100 years now of policies that have been put in place starting in the early 20th century that have just moved us more and more toward the centralization of power in the hands of the federal government. And what it's done is it's created a population which, like I was describing before, the more dependent you become on government programs, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, public schooling, the welfare state, the licensure system, government regulations or subsidies in order to prop up your business or prevent competition from competing with you, the more you see your livelihood tied to government policies, the more you will become dependent upon it, and the more that you will actually work to protect the thing, which is actually, in many ways, might be holding you back. Or at the very least is holding a lot of other people back, but you might be individually benefiting from. One of the things that Milton Friedman talks about that's so important is this whole concept of dispersed cost and concentrated interest. So for instance, if I'm running a business in such a way to where I don't want to compete with other people coming into the marketplace, well then I'm going to spend a lot of money donating to politicians that will write regulations in such a way, and we'll say it's for the safety of the consumer, but I'm going to write regulations in such a way that make it impossible for people to compete with me. Now, maybe this additional cost to you represents, let's say, $20 more a year in your grocery budget, and you don't even know, but it represents $25 million in revenue for the company or the industry that's pushing these regulations. Well, they have a concentrated benefit, and the cost is so dispersed around some millions of people that you don't feel it, and so you don't really advocate in opposition to it. And you might think, well, what's the big deal? Well, imagine that done, but imagine it done hundreds of thousands, if not millions of times over, and now it represents $1,000 in your grocery budget a year. So you'd be mad about that. But in order to actually get at that, you have to confront 500 things that happened. And the problem is nobody has the energy to do that. Well, that's the problem with what happens when you give the government too much power, is they start interfering in decisions in such a way where it's costing you something, but you don't associate the cost with the government policy. And they're counting on that. They're counting on that. And this is the part where, people will say, well, Nick, aren't you pro-business? I'm pro-free market. I cannot stand businesses that try to go to the government to give themselves special privileges at the expense of consumers and their competition. I despise that. That's not capitalism. That's not free markets. That's cronyism. In its worst manifestations, it's fascist economic policy. All right, SWBC, thank you again for the super chat. Conservatives with wealth need to start production studios, fact-based media outlets, schools, etc. Companies that don't answer to ESG, DEI, BlackRock, give base people an outlet. Totally agree. Totally agree. One of the things that we've tried to do, I'm going to sit up here. One of the things that we've tried to do is ensure that to the extent that we can do that, we're trying to build a business and we're trying to find other businesses that share those values. And so like in the small way that we can contribute to this, we're being deliberate in it. We're being deliberate in who we choose to do business with, what products that we choose to push and advance. And we appreciate the companies that also come alongside and support us in that same effort. So you're right. The more conservatives do this and the more they produce a good product, then the more consumers will actually gravitate toward those areas. Because I can tell you right now, I used to love Disneyland. Man, I remember as a kid, I remember the first time I took my kids there. I got home from my first tour in Iraq in 2006, and one of my greatest memories was taking my little girl to Disneyland for the first time and having her sit there with her favorite Disney princesses. And that's just, I kind of feel like I have that memory, but I won't be making new ones. Not with Disney. And I was willing to walk away because of how ridiculous it got, but I'm looking for alternatives because we do want those memories. We do want to create those things, and we want people to be able to produce them. There is a demand for it, but it can be difficult sometimes to break into those marketplaces, but that doesn't mean it's not worth a try, and I think what you just said was spot on. Ellen, not Sarah Lee. DeSantis is funded largely by Bush. To me, that makes him a dangerous candidate. What are your thoughts?
His polling suggests he's not a dangerous candidate, unfortunately.
Well, I don't. So I will say this. I have a lot of respect for Ron DeSantis. I think the work that he did in Florida has been pretty incredible. the idea that Florida went from a state that we could barely win and we were sitting there like biting our nails, at every election cycle, to one where, is just overwhelmingly conservative, and they set up good conservative policies within the state. And here's my frustration. To be honest, you asked me what are my thoughts, so I'm going to be really honest. I am really frustrated that him and Donald Trump are running against each other in this election cycle. In part because I anticipated this happening, that Trump was going to go after DeSantis hard because he saw him as the biggest threat for the candidacy for the nomination. And I hate what's happening right now because I'm sorry, there's a lot of Republicans that are the enemy. Ron DeSantis isn't one of them. Does that mean I agree with him on everything? No. There's things that I don't agree with Ron DeSantis on. There's things that I will be skeptical on. But overall, on the whole, DeSantis is not the enemy. Holy crap. Like, this is so frustrating to me. Like, we do this every single time where we will have a candidate that is our preferred candidate and we think it is their time. And I absolutely believe go out there and fight for your candidate. I'm telling you right now, I have not picked who my guy is for 2024. I want to see this thing. I want to see this thing work itself out. I want to give people an opportunity to get up there and share their ideas. But I will tell you this, as someone that has fought back against Republican establishment politics, as someone that has been chewed out by some pretty powerful people within the Republican Party because I would not get in line, I can tell you right now, nothing is more frustrating than when you find yourself in a situation where two people are running and both of them might be good, reliable conservatives. And it ends up being this thing with, because the two most reliable conservatives are the ones fighting for the nomination, they end up destroying each other. And it is not helpful to the long-term objectives that we have as either a party or either as the conservative movement. But it inevitably happens because, quite frankly, the consultant class also believe it's the most financially advantageous. It's the way you win the nomination. You don't win the nomination by making the best argument for why you would do the best job. You make it by destroying everybody else in the race. And it is self-destructive. And I've had it done to me. I've had someone that knew me very well, knew damn well I was a lot more conservative than they were, go out there and call me a swamp creature. And I had people believe it. And I'm having to sit there showing them my voting record and be like, at what point is there any evidence that I am anything that they're saying? And they were just so convinced. They were so convinced that what they didn't want was a swamp creature, that the moment that I had that label, that was it. That's all that mattered. And so I will just say I have gotten very, very cautious about just the constant narrative of trashing other candidates who I think overall have been pretty good and pretty faithful to what we believe. But again, that doesn't mean that things can't change. It doesn't mean that people can't show their true colors at some point and prove to be a rhino or a threat or whatever else. But until I see really hardcore evidence of something like that, I totally understand the people that prefer Trump. Totally understand it. I totally understand the people that prefer DeSantis. They have different reasons and they both have different credentials on various things. But man, I really hope, my hope, and it's not one that I base on a whole lot of confidence that's going to actually happen, but is that both of these guys can go forward, make a good argument. We can pick the one that we think is best for this particular election cycle. And then they can hopefully both go on and have a future at some point, regardless of what happens this time. But I don't see that happening. Okay, T-Man, thank you very much for the super chat. Hello from Sweden. I like you, Nick. Keep up your work. I might only know a sliver of it. Also, keep up your funny shorts. That's how I found you. Well, hey, thank you very much. I appreciate that. We always appreciate when people kind of let us know how they found the channel and the shorts. And we definitely really appreciate our international audience. If you're ever interested, we have our community chat as well. If you want to join that, it's one of the things that's been really cool for a lot of us when we go in there and we talk to people that are watching and tuning in from all over the world. And then they're also able to provide us a really, really unique perspective, because obviously a lot of what we talk about seems to be kind of America-centric for obvious reasons. But that we love talking about other topics as well. And we like talking about these philosophies because we don't feel that philosophies have a nationality. They can kind of go anywhere. They can be applied anywhere. And it's always great to be able to talk to people that have different experiences and perspectives. So thank you very much. All right. Do we have any more on the questions waiting?
We do have a few more super chats.
Okay. Ellen says, do you think the cost of public education per student should be refunded to parents who choose to homeschool? Yeah, I do. I think that I'm a big fan. So there's a couple different schools of thought on this. The compromise position is something like charter schools and ESAs. So ESAs are something where obviously dollars follow students, but you have a certain amount of money that's allocated for your students' education, and then you can take it into the marketplace. And then the other one is like the tax rebate or the tax credit, which is more of saying that if you assume personal responsibility for your child's education, then you can receive the tax credit up to a certain amount for that education. And I think some ideas are better than others, but I think both of those ideas actually move us in a better direction than what we have now. And I don't believe that we should allow, the perfect to be the enemy of the good. If we can't get the perfect, but we can get the good, let's get the good, right? Let's get something that provides parents more options and allows more of a marketplace for education rather than a one-size-fits-all government approach to education. Because that's a huge source of why we're in the problem we're in right now, is this idea that, well, the government's going to educate my kids, and then lo and behold, the kids think that the government's responsible for everything. How could that have happened? Well, I mean, I don't think we should be surprised. So I think what you suggested is perfectly reasonable. I think we have some other policies too that would be good. Sir Grog has asked, any time when all Republicans should be pulling together, we're in a sad situation. We have to become one to win. Otherwise, the other side will win. How will we accomplish this? Let me tell you. Okay, so now let me attack this from the other side. I was once talking to some people, and they were making the same argument, and I largely agree with this. I largely agree that, hey, look, we can have our fights and we can have our battles during the nomination contest and whatnot, but it does pay to work collaboratively when we are faced with kind of an either or proposition, which is either our guy's going to win or the other guy's going to win. So let's at least try to pull together to fight for our guy. By the same token, what I've had to explain to a lot of my colleagues when they're like, well, why won't the base get on board with X, Y, and Z? Don't they understand that if we don't get this, the Democrats are going to win? It's going to be even worse. And I'm like, let me tell you why the base doesn't believe you when you say that. They don't believe you because you've been in power before, you've had control before, and you refuse to do the things that you said you would do. And quite frankly, they're getting to the point where it's like, They don't want Republicans constantly compromising on core fundamental issues in order to make it a little bit less worse. They want an alternative. And if you're not willing to provide it, they will be willing at some point to burn it down. Because at some point, they need to get to the point where they can get the alternative. And if you don't got the guts to do it, well, then step aside, Hoss. So yes, we need to work together, but we also need to do a much better job of understanding that, when Democrats get power, they go as far and as fast as they possibly can. And then they shift the Overton window so far to the left that by the time we get power again, we're fighting to bring it back 25%. Well, what that means is it's a net 75% gain for the other side. No, the base wants to see Republicans that are actually proud of what we believe and willing to fight for it. And so for those Republicans that want to compete, understand that the base isn't being petulant. The base doesn't trust you anymore. And guess what? You're the reason why they don't trust you. So how about you practice doing a little bit better on what you told them you would do so that when it is time for all of us to get on board and fight for a particular candidate, they can be confident that you're at least not going to lie to them about what you're going to do. But if you can't do that, then you can't expect unity. You can't expect unity. It's unreasonable expectation.
Got time for one more super chat.
All right, one more super chat. Joseph, thank you very much. What are your views on candidates refusing to participate in debates? That's an interesting question. So the argument that I think Trump has made with why he didn't want to participate in the debate is because he doesn't, I think it's two things. I think one, he doesn't really feel like the modern debating process that we have is all that useful. And I kind of tend to agree. When you've got 11 candidates on stage or, whatever we got now, 7, 8, they all get asked kind of these dumb little base questions, and then they just take little snipes at each other in the hopes that they're going to get a really good soundbite because that's all that's going to come out from them. And so I actually like the method that Tucker Carlson was using where he invited people to come and he asked them difficult questions. And they had a chance to respond without wondering what one of the other 7 candidates were going to say right there on the stage standing next to him. So I do think there's something to say as far as a critique. But if you're going to say I'm not going to participate in the debates, but then I'm also not going to participate in anything else that would be an alternative, that's where I think that's weakness. But I don't think any of the candidates are necessarily doing that. Now, I will say this. I do think, we should be asking all of the candidates tough questions to include Trump. There's questions that Trump should have to answer as well with respect to things that happened during COVID or inflation. And so, look, as long as all of them are getting out there and all of them are having an opportunity to be able to answer serious questions in a forum that people can actually watch and have access to so they can make an informed decision, I think that's fine. So if they don't want to participate in a particular debate because they think it's not a good use of their time, they get to make that individual decision, and then we as the voters get to decide whether or not we agree with that decision. But I don't think any of the candidates are avoiding answering tough questions. I think some of them are just a little bit more skeptical of whether or not the traditional debate model works.
All right, we have one more super chat that we have to get to from Russell, and he says, "Let's see the mug."
All right, Russell, this is the mug I got today. It's the, I can't be held responsible for what my face does when you're talking, right? My face does when you talk. This was actually given to me by a colleague of mine in the General Assembly. She generously gave me this mug to be able to utilize. She's telling me that at one point during next session we've got to do a reel together because she has a mug too that she wants to feature, which is. It's pretty funny as well, but yeah. And thank you too. We've had people send mugs. We've also had a lot of people ask us, when are we going to start offering mugs? And I'm very happy to say that we've actually got 4 different mugs that we're kind of looking at in the works right now that we're hoping to be able to offer, I think ahead of Christmas, right?
Oh, yes.
We're going to be able to offer those mugs ahead of Christmas.
We're getting samples this week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and some people ask, like, why did it take so long? Well, one of the reasons why is because a lot of the people that do things like coffee mug fulfillment are very, very woke left-wing companies. And I'm not saying they don't do a good job with their products and their fulfillment, but we just decided, like, we're not working.
No, they do a fine job with their products and fulfillment, but we wanted to work with people who shared our values.
Yeah. And so it took us a lot. It took us some time to find somebody that could actually do it, and then we hope this is going to work out. We've got some alternatives that we might put into place too if we need to. But again, going back to the comment that was made earlier, we're trying to work with people that on some level share our values, or at the very least is not going to be openly hostile to them. So that's why it's taken us a while. All right, let's go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank you all for participating. Thank you for a lot of great questions. I got to tell you, it's a lot of fun for us when we get to the questions from the audience and we can really focus in on what you guys want to talk about after we've kind of gone through, the main topic of the episode. I think the main takeaway from all of this is, look, things are not going well in the United States. We know we've got a lot of work to do here. However, we actually are still in a much better position than any of the countries or even the confederations like the EU or alliances like BRICS that even hope to try to compete with us. And so that's one thing where we should be optimistic because as frustrated as we are about the status of the United States, we are still in the best position to lead. And by lead, we don't mean getting ourselves involved in a bunch of wars that are none of our business. We don't mean trying to be the world's police force. What we mean is continuing to stay and really advancing and even becoming better than we currently are with respect to a nation that is economically powerful, militarily powerful, so that we can protect ourselves and we can protect our people and we protect our way of life, as well as being a genuine land of opportunity where we are the easiest place to be able to come and to be able to engage in productive labor and start a business and find what your particular place is in the economy and being able to develop that and raise a family. That's what we mean by leading within the 21st century. It's leading by example, not leading by constant intervention. And so we think that our prospects for that are still good comparatively. We want to make them absolutely dominant by fixing those internal issues that we have. And once again, the good news that we've experienced with all of this, when you look at these problems that these other countries are facing, a lot of with the demographic problems, one of the best things that you can do for your country right now is, and a lot of people want to do this, and I know it can be hard, hey, get married, be a great husband, be a great wife, be a great father, be a great mother, have kids. They're fun to make. What can I say? Right? Get out there and again, raise your family in such a way, build those intentional communities, build your own, capabilities spiritually, emotionally, physically, professionally, because nothing bad happens from doing that. Right? Nothing bad happens from doing that. Those are good things to do when times are good. They're good things to do when times are bad. And it's going to give you a lot more power and control over your individual life, your individual decisions. And it's going to set you up to be the example when the other ideologies that are so prominent right now crumble around people and they are looking for an alternative to the lie that they were fed. And the best way that you can do that is not just to convince them of the lie, but also convince them of the truth. not just with your arguments, but with the way you live your life. Thank you very much for joining us. I also want to give another huge thank you to Good Ranchers for their support of this program, for their support of what we're trying to do. And we also want to support what they're doing, which is bringing you some of the best quality meat you can get on the market, delivered directly to your house. I know that we've done a 90-day challenge where a big part of what we were doing was, kind of like, how are we going to make ourselves more physical, formidable? How are we going to eat better? And one of the toughest things to do on that is menus. It's like setting up those established menus. And when you've got that product coming up to your door consistently and you know it's going to be there, it does actually help you provide a better, healthier menu. So use that promo code Nick. They're going to give you $25 off. They're going to give you free shipping if you sign up for one of the subscriptions, which again, you can pause if you need to. Sign up for one of those subscriptions. You can get an additional 2 pounds of very, very good quality ground beef. That's for the good burgers. That's what that's for. All right. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next episode.